So folks, just to get us started tonight, in the spirit of social justice for all, we begin this evening by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we may be on today throughout the world. In Canada, we especially acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. And this is just an invitation to consider how each of us can, in our own way, honor and amplify the voices of the original humans of this land. Let's commit to helping in the hard work of reconciliation and working in solidarity for the protection of our fellow animals, as well as the land, air, and waters. Okay, so you won't be able to unmute yourself tonight, but again, we invite you to chat, have fun with it. But folks, let's keep everything respectful. For those new to the AJA community, we strive to be a supportive community. We welcome debate, but in the spirit of bridge building, okay? Debate in the spirit of understanding, which means no name calling, no derision, and listening and treating each other as if everyone is a potential ally. We will hopefully have questions, time for questions near the end. But if you have questions, you can definitely throw them into the chat. But how I'd like you to do it to just differentiate from just the ongoing chat is star, 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 Q, and then the question. And that way, Kirsten will be able to pick up your question. Again, no promises. We got a lot of material to get through, but hopefully we'll be able to get some questions in the last bit. And also, just a note that we're going to be doing breakout groups following the panel for those who want to stay and further discuss, brainstorm, or collaborate around tonight's theme, just for half an hour, 8:30 to 9 Eastern Standard. And all you need to do to be part of that is just stay after the official goodbye. And you absolutely don't need to stay for it if you don't want to. And if you aren't already officially a part of the Animal Justice Academy community, I just want to let you know you can sign up for free at animaljusticeacademy.com. AJA is an offshoot of Animal Justice. And as a member of the community, you'll get access to our AJA self-paced course with 70 training modules for becoming the most powerful animal advocate possible, as well as bi-weekly Animal Justice Academy lunchtime live workshops and then these monthly panels. And there's, of course, tons of replays of our past panels and lunchtime lives on our course platform. You'll also be part of the collective actions we take, and you can be part of our private Facebook group where we do a lot of exciting sort of bonding and collaborating. Our next lunchtime live is Thursday, February 10th, and it's all about kids and animal advocacy. And also, we finally, it took us a year, but we're finally on, AJA is finally on Instagram, and we have a public Facebook page. So look us up and follow and like and all that sort of thing. Of course, Animal Justice also has all the social medias all the time. So can we get a spotlight here, Kirsten? Our topic tonight, again, is regenerative grazing and low carbon chickens, how we can fight the greenwashing of animal agriculture. So as many folks here already know, animal agriculture is a leading cause of the climate crisis. Yet you wouldn't know it by all the environmental conversations going on. And that's partially thanks to greenwashing from the meat, egg, and dairy industries. So tonight, our panelists, they're brilliant. We're so lucky to have them out in the world. They're going to help us deconstruct the environmental myths and information that's out there kind of muddying the waters and arm us with the facts we need to effectively dismantle them. So speaking of all the panelists, do we have them all spotlit? Yes, we do. Okay, success. Sometimes the spotlight doesn't work. I want to give you just a quick little background of these wonderful people. So we're going to start with Nicholas Carter. Hello, Nick. Nick is an ecologist and co-founder of plantbaseddata.org. He's the communications lead for one of the Canadian Centre for Climate Services data hubs and serves as an advisory board member to several food and environment-focused organizations. He's also a science writer on the interconnections between agriculture and planetary health. He's completed a master's degree in environmental practice from Royal Roads University, where his research focused on the global greenhouse gas emissions that are attributed to animal ag. Welcome, Nick. So good to have you here. All right.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yay. Okay, we are going to go on to Adria Vasil. She is one of Canada's leading environmental journalists with 2 decades of experience in sustainability, reporting, and a trio of best-selling books on green living. This longtime ecoholic columnist is now managing editor at Corporate Nights, a sustainable business magazine. Excellent magazine, folks, if you haven't checked it out. And it is circulated in the Globe and Mail and Washington Post. Adria, thank you for coming. It's so good to have you here.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, excellent. Okay, and then we have Jason Hannan, is an associate professor in the Department of Rhetoric, Writing, and Communications at the University of Winnipeg, my home province of Manitoba. He's the editor of Meatsplaining, the Animal Agriculture Industry and the Rhetoric of Denial. His current animal-related book project is New White Saviors, the Colonial Mythology of Meat. Jason teaches a course at UW called The Rhetoric of Animality, which examines how Western religion, culture, and society reinforces human power and domination over animals. Jason's also the chair of the Winnipeg Veg Fest, the largest vegan and animal rights festival in Manitoba. Jason, so good to have you back, buddy.
Thank you for having me.
Yay. And last but certainly not least, we have Jennifer Molidor, who is a senior food campaigner at the Center for Biological Diversity, a national conservation nonprofit where she leads sustainable food initiatives, including the Take Extinction Off Your Plate campaign. Jennifer drives the population and sustainability programs, earth-friendly diet advocacy related to industrial animal agriculture, overpopulation, and overconsumption, and the impact of our food systems on wildlife and the planet. Jennifer holds a PhD from the University of Notre Dame and taught for many years as a professor at Kansas State University and San Francisco State University. She's written on the greenwashing of animal agriculture and its effects on policy and cultural behaviors in outlets like The Hill, Chicago Business, Food Tank, Sentient Media, and just so many others. Jennifer, I'm so happy to have you on board tonight.
Great to be here. Thanks.
All right, folks, so let's start off with a little bit of the history and the psychology of big ag greenwashing. How did all this greenwashing animal ag come to be? Now, Jason, you're the expert in rhetoric. I think I'm going to throw this to you just to start the conversation off.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, I just finished and submitted a chapter on this called Grass-Fed Lies for this book on sustainable agriculture. And so I frame that history in terms of a shift between 2 different narratives. The first one beginning around the 90s and the early 2000s, revolving around the slow food movement in the United States, Joel Salatin and Michael Pollan being 2 of the biggest kind of voices promoting a certain model of animal agriculture. And Pollan's 2002 essay, An Animal's Place, which really kind of popularized this idea of a certain kind of humane and ethical and sustainable model of animal agriculture. And so it focused very heavily as an example on Joel Salatin's Polyface farm in Virginia, which I think started around like the 60s or something like that. And its initial kind of model was always intended to be that it was natural, that it was not going to use synthetics and chemicals and that sort of thing. It really did not have anything to do with the climate. It was just meant to be free of fertilizer and you know, bad chemicals and that sort of thing, right? And so part of his claim was that this model of, sorry, I think that's me. This model of agriculture mimics natural cycles. So there's rotational grazing. You do a bit of grazing here, and then you move to another part of the land, and then another part of the land. And this is a way of mimicking natural cycles. And his kind of environmental claims really did not rise beyond the level of just superficial ideas about what is, you know, quote unquote natural, right? And I have to say, as somebody who bought this kind of line back in the day, because I used to be a big sort of enthusiast of grass-fed meat, I used to buy these products and the free range this and that. those of us who kind of bought this idea did not look beyond just the label that this was done organically, right? We didn't really delve deep into the actual environmental claims and evidence. And I don't think that community really cares very much beyond simply the label that it's organic and that it's natural. So this was, I think, the dominant model and the dominant narrative until the early 2010s, when a different claim and a different model was proposed, mainly by Alan Savory, the Zimbabwean animal farmer. He's a son of colonial administrators, who has this very popular TED Talk in which he made this claim that his model of animal ag, which he calls holistic grazing, has the power to reverse the effects of climate change, right? That we could take climate effects and reverse them to pre-industrial levels. And that has since kind of taken not just the animal farming community by storm, but it's taken other industries by storm as well. And one of the, I think, most kind of nefarious things that this new model managed to do was to inject this idea of regenerative into the public vocabulary, right? So it started with regenerative grazing, and now that term has been adopted by a number of other different industries to the point where it's just become kind of absurd. So Walmart now claims that it's aiming to be a regenerative company, right? So it's the introduction of a lot of I think simplistic, fashionable concepts and ideas that don't really have enough substance, but that are very efficient at kind of rebranding the industry and giving it a basically total makeover and allowing it to kind of masquerade as something that it totally is not. That's a very, very simple kind of picture of that paradigm shift from like the old model of just merely, humane and environmentally friendly to a weapon in the fight against climate change.
So let's regenerative grazing, and we're going to spend a lot of time on that tonight, but there are a lot of greenwashing myths out there. If anybody want to throw some of those other myths out there, rattle them off.
Well, one of them affiliated with regenerative is certainly that the soil, whether that's, soil on which, the beef, the cattle are grazing, or vegetables are planted, that the Earth's soil can actually absorb 100% of all the pollution we've ever made in the world, and that we continue to turn out from coal and oil and so on. That's a big one that's going around. And the myths are endless, though. They keep going, carbon neutral beef, net zero beef industry. Those are increasingly common. You're hearing the largest meat processor in the world, like JBS in Brazil, saying, we're going net zero. Something's wrong.
Yeah, I see, two sort of categories for this greenwashing. First is that cows are a part of nature, or that nature needs cows. This will entail like cows are just like bison, they're good for grasslands, they promote biodiversity. The reality is that cows are an invasive non-native species. The other is that cows are not only needed for nature, but that they can save the world, right? That they're a climate solution, that if we don't do ranching, this land will turn into condos and development, this false dichotomy. And then the biggest one that's probably the most harmful in terms of this topic is it's not the cow, it's the how. So we can just sort of modify, we put masks on the cow and that will limit their methane. We can,
give them seaweed.
Yeah, these kinds of things. And so it's this two sort of categories: making cows natural, which they're not, removing all of the natural processes as well from this, and sort of recolonizing the food system, because a lot of these practices were indigenous in nature and they were sort of co-opted now like JBS, but also like Cargill, and then fossil fuel companies that call themselves regenerative too. So I think both this idea that they're the solution to the climate crisis and also that they're part of the natural world.
Well,
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Nick, please.
Yeah, let me just echo those statements. I mean, it's very well said. I think a lot of environmentalists, especially, they think that eating local and buying local is one of the best things you can do in the food space. And there's lots of data that backs it up that it's not necessarily the case. I think a major myth too is that shifting to a fully plant-based diet equals that you're supporting nothing but monocultures, not necessarily knowing that most monocultures are rows and rows of feed crops directed towards animals. And we can get into that stuff, but that's what I see very, very often. Yeah, just the fact that the myth that so much land is so-called marginal, that it can only be used for grazing, and that's the best use of that land, and there's no other use for that land. That's something I see very often, and it almost makes that something that can't be negotiable, as if there isn't other uses of the land. Say wildlife that is displaced, wildlife that it's fencing away. So I think those are a couple ones that come up so often. And of course, it's not the cow, it's the how. It's one of the overarching kind of branding that I would say has been popularized, if not started from Alan Savory, it's definitely part of the movement now.
You have a dartboard with Alan Savory's face on it, Nick? Because I don't know, if I was in your line of work, that's what I would be doing.
Yeah, I mean, we've discussed back and forth, me and him, and yeah, I was totally open to doing a debate with him, but it didn't end up working out. And actually, I'm actually uncertain how a debate would even happen, because the scientific method is not something he follows. It's more of like a, it's a cult. It's a cult. It's an ideology. That's what this is. And he's even expressed himself that he doesn't support the scientific method. He doesn't think it's useful. And he uses very vague terms, like it's how you manage the land. And if you aren't doing something right, or you're not getting the right result, then you're managing it wrong and poorly. So it's that type of language that is very deceiving. And I can see how it's convinced a lot of people.
Well, and so because we're going to dive into almost all of these myths that you folks mentioned. But before we do, just to get a better sense of how have they been able to sell these myths with basically no science? I mean, Ryan here in the chat said he's tried to find some sort of paper, some sort of science to support Alan Savory, and there's nothing out there. How has the public why have they swallowed this? What, any theories around that and how the techniques they've used, or just really the beholders of this information and the mindset that they're in? Yeah, Jason.
I mean, I think the most obvious way is by distancing themselves and defining themselves against the factory farm model, right? So when it was pointed out that beef has really adverse health consequences, they will say, okay, well, that's factory farm beef. Grass-fed beef is healthy for you, right? If you point out that beef is bad for the climate, they'll say, well, that's factory farm beef. Grass-fed beef is good for the climate. So they've done this very kind of strategic defining themselves against, this other kind of, big bad model, and redefining themselves as good and innocent and healthy and so forth. So that kind of a contrast, unfortunately, has been very effective in, you just distance yourself from the evil, right? And I think it's proven to have been very seductive for a lot of people's imagination.
And I think as journalists as well, we're very eager to report on negative stories, but at the same time, there is kind of, I think, a hunger around climate change to have some kind of feel-good news to share and to tell a personal story of how, this person left their city life and moved to the country and decided to start a farm, and here they are with all their cattle and all the good that they're doing for the planet. Go figure, here's some guilt-free beef. And I think any media stories that kind of help us assuage our guilt around any of our high carbon living, they take off, they go viral. People are really excited to read that, right? So they don't have to continue to feel bad about their choices, and that there are options out there, even if not everyone can afford those options either. But so those kinds of stories do end up being quite popular, and for journalists tempting to embrace. I mean, I whenever I do an agriculture related story, one of my favorite things is that I get to go to the country and visit a farmer and hang out for the day. But but I haven't written one encouraging regenerative beef, but it is I can see that there. And as well, if a company sends a press release to a very busy time constrained journalist, and they say, hey, look, we've started selling this amazing, we're going low carbon, we are going to be net zero beef, and here's our story and here's our stats, and we're going to be, this beef is going to have a near carbon neutral footprint, and we've presented all the data for you here in this press release. It's very tempting for today's journalists that have zero time, that are told to turn over a story in a matter of hours online, to just reach for those press releases and use those as the fodder for their stories without doing significant research. And that is a problem. That's why you end up with a lot of these stories repeated.
It's interesting that you say that, because this has been bothering me for a long time. And so I've been tracking the media for years now, trying to figure out what's going on. And it is this sort of regurgitation of the same exact talking points without any real critical apparatus to it. And then I've also been tracking like who's investing and funding these organizations that are coming out with this grass-fed advocacy. And right before this program, I was reading something from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services that was advocating for ranching and conservation programs. So it's really pervasive all over. And I think part of it is because, as you're saying, we want to have some optimism about a solution and assuage our guilt. But I think it's also related to the culture wars, where we're heavily romanticizing the myth of this pastoral myth of the romantic idea of the rancher and the farmer as the roots of society and saving us all and feeding everyone, at least down in the United States and where I'm in the agricultural area. It's really, really pervasive, and the small farmer myth rooted in the ground, stewards of the land, totally whitewashing the colonial history of ranching and the ways that cattle were used to eradicate indigenous peoples. Anyway, so I think it's in terms of media with movies and journalism and that kind of thing, sort of regurgitating it, the localism movement, the local food and that kind of thing, really heavily overstating the benefits and romanticizing the livestock industry that often isn't these small little farms, but it's this sort of huge operation.
And that's a whole other thing too, right? Farmer washing, where you walk into a grocery store and every ad you see related to a large meat company just has a beautiful pastoral red barn with a few animals on the property. But Corporate Knights did a story last summer on big meat pulling from big oil's playbook to delay climate action, and how US-based agri-giants have been spending millions to downplay the role of the meat and dairy industry in climate change. And so that feeds into everything you were just saying as well.
Yeah, and I think really to answer the question, it's two high level areas. It's the cultural idea of this beautiful, lush farm that's ingrained in us since kids too. Storybooks, old McDonald's farm. This is something that we're told to believe very young. So the marketing has already been done since most of us have been kids. So imagine if, like, say, the coal industry, the fossil fuel industry was able to show that they're able to burn energy with big lush fields, right? They would eat that up. And really, in reality, a factory farm doesn't look much different than a fossil fuel factory. Like it's just a whole lot of tanks and a lot of crammed animals, and just so I think the marketing in this space and the subsidies and the lobbying is a big reason why they're able to sell these myths.
So in terms of, I see lots of spam happening in the chat. So moderators, if you can get on that to get that person out, that would be great. or those people. In terms of being able to effectively explain why eating animals and animal products is so environmentally damaging and why eating plants could actually be a solution, what are some of the most effective stats that we've got a whole bunch of animal advocates here. What are some of the stats that we could use, talking points that we could use that are, you think, the most important right off the bat, top level? What do you tell people? Nick, let's start with you because I know you talk about this all the time.
I would say land use has to be one of the number one things mentioned. Half of all habitable land on the planet is used for agriculture, and upwards of about 80% of that is directly for farming animals. And it's for grazing, it's for feed crops. And it's not like this returns a whole lot back in calories. It only returns about 18% back in calories. So it's a huge demand on the food system we're running. And it doesn't return much back. So I think understanding land is very important. And then flip that around. Say we shift away from animal agriculture, how much land does that free up? And there's been studies on this. It's been shown that you could free up 3 billion hectares of land. And that amount of land is equivalent to the size of the continent of Africa. And we're talking a whole lot of carbon that can be drawn down between now and 2050. So I think land is really important to see how it's used right now and how it could be used instead. Just for grasslands in general, there's so much of the myths is around the idea that it's a native grassland and it needs to stay that way. But there's been studies that show that upwards of 42% of grasslands actually used to be forest or at least woody savannas. So we need to revert those back. And also understand that a rewilded grassland with native animals running free is also a better way of using a grassland. So, I could go on and on with this, but I think land is one of the biggest things that that everyone should kind of wrap their heads around.
Can we talk about also, some of this stats also around, there's so many ways that we can attack this, protein versus emissions, feed conversion rates, calorie per acre. What have you found to be the most effective way to get through to people, Jennifer?
In terms of, if we were just to talk about regenerative grazing and why there isn't more call for meat reduction, for example, from these people who are holding this up as an ideal, doesn't make any sense to me because they would profit more from a smaller scale. If we look at how much we say in the United States, these are my stats, and you can find these and take extinction off your plate. Americans eat 3 times the global average in meat and dairy and 4 times the global average in beef, for example. So it's such a big scale. So to come in and say we can just all switch to this grass-fed model, there's a Harvard study that shows that at best, we really could only support about 30% of what we produce in that model, and it would still have enormous environmental impact. So to ignore that, is a huge flaw in that argument, whether you're trying to move away from the CAFO factory farm model or not. But some of the other things I look at, everybody sort of argues about the climate impacts. And one of the things that is downplayed a lot by ag industry talking points is the impact of methane. And animal agriculture, particularly beef and dairy, but animal agriculture is the leading source of methane in the United States. So to downplay that and minimize that, is really misleading. And the numbers that they try to downplay are small because they compare them to, say, fossil fuels and the rest of sort of emissions. But another area besides pesticides, feed crops, land, as Nicholas mentioned, and water and manure and these kinds of stats, which I have tons of. Another area besides this that people often overlook is the impact on wildlife and biodiversity. So even if we just talk about the animals that are directly killed on behalf of animal agriculture producers, it's hundreds of thousands and sometimes millions, for example, by wildlife services and other programs. So the amount of species that are endangered, something like half of the endangered species are also threatened by grazing. And then we could talk about seafood, half of the seafood is wasted. And so we need to return wildlife to the conversation in terms of stats that are convincing about the problem. And I think sometimes people will focus on either they get into a niche of, say, carbon, and they have this discussion about carbon or soil. or they'll even talk about the ethics of animal agriculture itself, all of which are valid, but we often forget or don't make that connection to water and nature and wildlife as well.
Well, so there's greenwashing going on in various areas. And I want to talk about all of those. I want to talk about not just the cows, but it is the mother of greenwashing myths. How the hell this idea of generative grazing got flouted as the answer to saving the world's soil. So can you've been the one talking, Nick, to Alan. You're very aware of his arguments and what regenerative grazing activists, advocates are saying. So can you explain what they say is how they're going to save the world through cows versus what the actual science is? Can you give us a little breakdown?
So largely what's happening in these new regenerative ranching farms is you have a mixed farming of plants and livestock. And there is a lot of good things that is happening within regenerative agriculture, applying compost, using cover crops, not tilling. These are all things that have been part of what could be named conservation agriculture, or certainly lots of indigenous practices way back. Now they're incorporating some of this, but largely what they're doing is they're attributing a lot of the benefits to cattle. And they're doing this through studies. They're doing this through paid academics that largely are not interested in exploring different uses of the land. They're just interested in showing any perhaps improvement in that land. And they're also doing this from, say you're replacing a piece of land that was intensively cropped with the same crop. It's maybe even virtually desertified. If you put cattle on that land and you bring in compost, and you allow them to eat some food, which a lot of the time is brought in from other land that was able to actually grow the food, and then they're gonna put manure all over the land, and they're gonna say the cows are the reasons why we improve this land. Not true. It's not true at all. All you're doing is moving carbon and nutrients from one area of land to the other. So they're doing this with all these manipulative academic studies that show that it is perhaps a slight improvement. They're never looking at methane, like Jennifer, you mentioned. Methane is rarely ever mentioned. The scalability of this is rarely ever mentioned. So off the top, if you're ever talking to someone that's really touting the benefits of regenerative ranching, have them discuss with you methane, and have them discuss how possibly you could do this on more land that we're already using, without mass deforestation and without increasing the biodiversity crisis we're in. So yeah, outside of that, they're also doing that just with all kinds of very selective language and just a lot of jargon that is really just designed to confuse, help people feel good about what they're eating, and then to add to all that, there's virtually zero regulation on whether something is regenerative beef or not. I don't see that happening anytime soon. And, I think, to be clear, there can be some sort of regenerative label, and there's many ways to grow plants regeneratively. So this is the way we should be going.
Nick, you brought up something that I think is just important to hit home, because I've seen this confusion sort of in animal advocacy circles. Regenerative farming is good. It's regenerative grazing that's bullshit, right? So it's a really important thing, because some people are painting all regenerative farming as BS, and that is, like, regenerative farming, generally growing, is something we all should be aspiring to. It's the regenerative grazing that we have a beef with. Sorry, that just came out. Oh my God. Okay, so
can I just jump in there for a second to clarify?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just that the point you were making about Nicholas, about the lack of a label around regenerative, means there are problems on the plant side as well, because anyone can come around and say, whether you're PepsiCo or whatnot, and say all of our ingredients will be 100% regenerative by 2030. That starts to raise questions as well. General Mills, Kellogg, the list goes on. And there is no sheriff in town policing the regenerative label. And what I found in a piece I did last summer for Corporate Nights, again, not to plug it, but was that actually a lot of the farmers that are going no-till and regenerative on the conventional side in the US, saying we went from conventional to regenerative, are still using a lot of Roundup on their grains and so on. So just a side note, I know it's not related to our grazing topic, but keep in mind when you're thinking regenerative, if done well, then it's a fantastic way to grow plants. But it's also a term that can be abused.
In addition to lack
You go ahead. Yep.
definitions, regulation, there are some certifications, but from the industry, a lot of things are left out, like scale. Like some of the benefits that are touted are because they've had less cows on the land, not because they have more cows doing different things. And then when there are practices, best intention, the best possible, best region, best climate, that kind of thing, some of the things that are left out is that they have to be supplemented with feed, which takes additional water and that kind of thing. So there's huge overstatements to this. That's the real issue, is that they've taken regenerative vegetable gardening and in the best possible scenarios from this, and then added it to a model of animal agriculture, and then vastly overstated it, and then neglected to mention things like methane, or that it can't be scaled. And so it's not that we are against it, improving practices, but that it's way overstated.
Like
Yeah,
Jennifer,
exactly.
oh, sorry, Nick, go ahead.
I was just going to say, as a whole, agriculture, even the best forms of plant agriculture, it's still an extractive process. And this is why a big reason why we want to shift to plant-based diets is because we can free up so much land. And it's been modeled that land that's untouched, land that's protected, allowed to have wildlife running free, is going to draw down way more carbon, and far more than even the best form of plant agriculture. So really the goal is not necessarily to bring farmers along to say you can turn your plant farm into a major carbon sink. That's not necessarily the case, but all the landowners, we can credit them for conservation practices that can help benefit wildlife and help draw down carbon in a way, and that certainly can be regulated.
I have two questions to clarify for me and those that aren't as savvy as you folks. First of all, what do they claim is the difference between regenerative grazing and regular grazing? Can you just give me a little lowdown on what the big difference is? Anybody?
In the best case scenario, the grazers who have this sort of model hope of abundance and healing, that they're promoting biodiversity by caring about the watersheds. Unfortunately, this is not defined either. So they might say we have more birds. They might not be native birds. They might be a healthy ecosystem, just more. Protecting the earth, that, rather than just putting cows out to pasture. And the vagueness is really the thing. And I've written a piece you might have read that said there's no magical cows. A cow is a cow. But to give credit, in the best case scenario, is that in specific regions, they would be attending to things like the soil. They would be including rotational, moving from multi-paddocks, cover crops, and just sort of working this into the landscape and trying to be natural. And again, pretending that cows are natural.
Yeah, and having to limit those cows, the number, incredibly. I remember hearing a stat from probably one of you about how many earths we would need to have to be able to get all of the beef that people are eating in the world produced via the regenerative grazing model. Does anybody have that offhand? 5 planet Earths, Hope says. I'm not sure.
Planet Earth is how much we need if the rest of the world ate like North Americans.
Ah, I see. Okay, got it. So, so from what I understand, it is possible for grazing to keep more carbon in the soil than, say, tilled monocrops. But proponents of regenerative grazing, they never bring up the emissions part of the equation. I think that's the big thing, right? They never bring up what the cows are putting into the air, especially the methane. So is it at all possible, just so we know this and we can be sure of it, is it at all possible for pasture-raised beef to break even environmentally?
I would say If the metric is environmentally, no. If the metric is carbon drawdown, technically you could have a couple cows in grazing on a very huge piece of land that has lots of trees, and yeah, you could say it draws down more carbon. But there's been meta-analyses on looking at commercial farms across the world, and it showed in even the most optimistic scenarios that at most in some of the best forms of grazing, you're only going to draw down about 20% of equivalent of what they emit in methane. 20 to 60%. So it could even be as high as 60%, but you're not offsetting the methane. That's the important part. And I think there's this misconception that when you're shifting to grass-fed beef, that that in itself is reducing some methane. That's not true. When you're shifting from a feedlot, primarily feedlot cow to grazing, you're going to increase their methane by 3 to 4 times. And the reason why this happens is because partly because they live slightly longer lives. We're talking like maybe a year longer, but also they're eating a more fibrous diet. So that creates more burps, and that's why they emit more methane. So
I think one thing that people are not aware of necessarily is that all cows graze. So when we're calling it grass-fed beef, for example, right, we're really talking about grass-finished. And so also some of the things we also leave out of the conversation when we're talking about this is that in the best case scenarios, it is limited to certain conditions in certain regions and certain time limitations of the carbon sequestration, a certain scale, certain small stocking herds, certain types of methods, certain ecosystems that would, they haven't co-evolved with, but certain methods of predator control and coexistence and, leaving out irrigation and these kinds of things. So very, very limited opportunities. There are some of the opportunities where well-managed grazing can have some kind of benefit, but it's such a limited scenario. And there's really no evidence to suggest that rewilding wouldn't do it better, that reintroducing native species wouldn't do all of this better than any benefit that cattle can have.
So let's move to that. That's a sub-myth of the regenerative grazing, is that of marginal lands, that the land animals graze on can't be used to grow any other food in any other way. Can we talk about this? Can we talk about if that's true? Okay, because that's something that I even thought at one point. I'm like, well, it's land that can't be used for anything else.
So this is probably the thing that irritates me above all else, because it indicates a total lack of understanding of ecology and nature. And it also is a very extractive, exploitive way of looking at who we are as humans and how we live on this earth and other creatures. It is an economic term. It's not an environmental term, and it treats the earth as only valuable in terms of its use value and what we can extract from the land. Like, can we grow crops here? Can we graze cattle? Can we remove uranium? Can we drill for oil? That's a terrible way of thinking about how we live on the planet. So a lot of this is calling marginal lands desert areas where there's people and there's biodiversity hotspots and there's wildlife and there's ecosystems that we need for a healthy planet. And so marginal lands is complete baloney, and it's very harmful.
Yeah, so the idea of, and just for some folks that don't know about the idea of rewilding, does anybody want to just give a little sort of explanation of rewilding in terms of carbon?
I mean, there's many different types of rewilding. There's really passive rewilding, where you're just letting land recover, and you're doing that over time, and it's going to draw down a lot of carbon. Or there's some more active forms of rewilding, where you're planting some native trees to that area, or shrubs or anything that would particularly work there. And in doing this and looking at what was on that piece of land, then you're going to mimic how it was before, and you're going to benefit the land the most in terms of carbon drawdown, in terms of biodiversity. I think at the same time as you're thinking of all this land that would be freed up, it can't just go towards like the same large landowners. A big part of the amount of land that should be freed up should also be part of land back programs for Indigenous people that land was stolen from. I think that always needs to be part of this, and that could be a big part of a plant-based shift.
Adria, you've been in the environmental movement for a long time, and it seems, the conversation seemed to be so much about the carbon. Why is methane not a bigger part of the conversation, and should it be?
It feels like it was earlier in discussions around the problems with beef and its role in climate change. It certainly was when I was writing the Ecoholic column and writing around issues related to meat, in 2007, 2008. We were more focused on methane, but it seems like when regenerative came on the scene, it shifted to how much carbon, organic matter in the soil could help lock in. And that is true that, regenerative farms, et cetera, growing plants, we're finding that they have this ability because of the organic matter in the soil that's better preserved. In certain conditions, right? In certain scenarios, they do have the potential to lock in more carbon, but that's when we kind of got the blinders on related to carbon and stopped talking about methane, which was really the main focus of conversation and why people started slamming beef in a climate change context for years. So it is a bit odd that the attention entirely shifted and no one seems to have noticed. Can't explain it, but maybe Jason can, I don't know.
Well, it's inconvenient to mention methane because it undercuts their narrative, right? Part of it is the holistic grazing, regenerative grazing idea invests so much hope in the magic of the alchemy of a cow's stomach, right? That by eating grass, the cows will produce a magical kind of poop, which then gets trampled into the ground, and it's a kind of weird sort of idolatry of the cow, but to maintain that this kind of bovine theology requires completely denying the fact that they are emitters of methane, right? So they will trivialize it by emphasizing that it has a very short shelf life in the atmosphere, and that carbon is therefore what we have to focus on. So yeah, they just trivialize it and negate its importance completely.
Methane is so much more powerful in the long term. Like it's so much more toxic. How much more toxic is methane than carbon?
Over 20 years, it's 86 times more potent. And that's typically how I think it should be measured. Yeah. And I think methane particularly did have some emphasis in the latest IPCC report. And I think that's important. I think it is coming back to having some importance. There wasn't nearly as much about agriculture mentioned as there should be. But animal agriculture is the leading global source of methane, and it's followed very shortly behind from fossil fuels, natural gas being a big one too, which on its own is greenwashed in the energy sector in a major way too. So I think they have both angles working against them from the energy side and the agricultural side, which is hurting methane from getting the importance it should.
So I want to switch gears a little bit. I want to talk about, the fact that factory farming, intensive agricultural farming is horrific on an animal ethics level. And from, again, an animal ethics side, it's what we're focusing on trying to first get rid of. But it seems it's actually better for greenhouse gases than grazing. So for those ready to look to even more intensive farming as an answer to the environmental problem of animal ag, can we talk about the overall environmental costs of factory farming? Okay, so talk about what we need to know to be able to say, yeah, no, let's not even considering this whole grazing thing, but what's happening in the rest of animal agriculture.
I mean, I can speak to this.
Please do, Nick.
So yeah, I think factory farming is largely how people are getting their food. I think this is important to acknowledge first. Like, obviously, grazing takes up, in pasture, beef takes up a lot of kind of headspace and marketing space, but largely it's factory farming that gets people animal products. So yeah, in terms of the environmental impacts of factory farming, it's the list is very extensive. I would say it's probably the single largest driver of deforestation, and it depends slightly on where you are. But I mean, look at the Amazon. Largely, that's being deforested for soy feed crops for confined animals. In that case, it's mostly in Europe and China. But there's many other areas too where mass feed crops are the cause of deforestation. And I think manure is a huge part of the issue with factory farms too. Just there's huge manure lagoons, and then that's sprayed out onto fields. And then that doesn't all get absorbed into the land, not even close. A lot of that runs off into streams, into oceans, resulting in dead zones, resulting in big bodies of water that are completely devoid of life. And this is the result of factory farming. It's very energy intensive. There's all kinds of air pollution, which creates all kinds of health risk as well. So the list is very long for the environmental impacts from factory farming.
Can somebody address a little bit more the whole idea of the majority of crops that are grown on this planet going towards feed? Jennifer or Nick, can you speak to that? Nick, you're on a roll. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So with feed crops, I mean, it depends on what feed crop you're talking about, but like take soy, for example, 80% of all soy globally is going directly towards confined animals. And I think a really important point that often gets forgotten about this is this soy is not perfectly being converted into protein in the form of meat. There's a huge energy loss when you feed crops to animals. With chickens, people think chickens are typically better in terms of the environment. And the reason is because they're able to convert feed crops slightly better. But say you feed 100 calories of grain or soy to a chicken, they're only returning about 12 calories back in chicken meat. So you're talking about
ridiculous, Nick.
a 90%.
Calories?
Yeah, that's it.
Like, I want everybody to stop and hear that. 100 grams or 100 calories fed to the chicken, and what comes out as the product that we consume, not we, but others consume, is 12 calories.
So you're talking about a 90% loss when you're doing that. So in terms of people working on food waste is a major issue. I care about it deeply. The biggest source of food waste is definitely from what we're doing here. You lose so much in terms of calories and protein when you're feeding these protein crops to animals that you know they need to live their lives. That's why we have such a loss, right? And it's certainly not a good life, but that's why you have that loss, and that's why it has such an impact too, because you need that much more land, water, resources to grow these feed crops, and you end up losing so much of it.
So, yeah, I mean, one of the concerns, as I weighed in further to this, as far as approach and campaigns and where to focus, is worrying that the messaging around beef, that beef is the bad, the bad player, the bad, is causing the consumption of smaller animals like chickens, like fishes, to skyrocket. Does that worry the folks on this panel?
There's been a huge skyrocketing in the amount of chicken consumption in Canada. We, hear about beef levels stagnating and herd shrinking, but certainly people are turning to alternative proteins and feeling alternative proteins as alternative meats and feeling better about those choices. But I don't know if you most of you are probably familiar with the Chicken Farmers of Canada's Let's Talk Chicken and Sustainable Chicken campaign. Jessica Scott-Reid, who's an awesome journalist who's here with us somewhere tonight, wrote a piece for us on chicken industry greenwash. And the chicken industry points to the fact that they did this life cycle analysis that over the last a few decades, the carbon footprint of Canadian chicken has decreased by 37% or something. And so we're supposed to then applaud and say, oh, well, let's all eat more chicken. But what Jessica found when she looked around was that they're essentially sacrificing animal welfare to cram more chickens into barns. I believe Nicholas, that she gave you a call and you spoke about this as well. We have you quoted in the magazine as saying just that they are just cramming more chickens into barns to improve their carbon footprint.
This is their version of low carbon poultry, I understand.
Yeah, exactly. So they said a really interesting stat to us at one point. I've got to pull this up. They said, oh, well, 62% of the entire sector's total energy use comes from renewable sources. So that helps us make us green. And Jessica went back to them and said, okay, what do you mean by this? What is your renewable source here? And is it because you have solar panels on your barns or something? And they clarified that because the chicken feed, like the soy and so on, grew under the sun, they consider 60% of the industry's energy used as renewable. And
dear Lord.
Speechless. Wow. As Jessica can attest, our jaws just dropped. Like, that's really your logic, and you're running with it. Okay.
A little stretch.
Yeah, definitely a stretch. So they are stretching the facts to make themselves out to be much greener than they are, and to make people feel better about, they're not saying even go buy organic chicken. They're saying our conventional chicken that you can find anywhere on any shelf is so great for these reasons. And that is a big problem. Canadians are buying it. And they're buying
like
it.
Saying low cancer cigarettes is the new thing.
Exactly. Well, Philip Morris has come out with a low carbon campaign, which is funny, but that's a whole other thing.
Oh, dear Lord. Before we move on from this topic, Jennifer, can you give us a little idea with the fishes, and marine life, that isn't guilt-free. There is a lot of environmental consequences, a lot of environmental damage that's happening from people consuming fishes and marine life, right?
Yeah, and I think also, from the animal perspective, for a long time, the idea that fish were somehow insensitive to pain and that kind of exploitation was less bad. It's related to that industry, but yeah, 500 million to 1 billion pounds of fish are wasted. Like half of the fish caught is wasted. So there's that right there. But then there's Bycatch, which catches thousands of endangered and threatened and already protected marine animals that we know of. And this is an industry where we probably don't know the worst of the worst. And the methods of fishing are extremely damaging. There's something, I have a stat here somewhere, something about the amount of fishing gear. 500 million tons of fishing gear are lost or discarded intentionally into the ocean every year. So in terms of harming endangered species, in terms of harming non-endangered species, the fishing industry is something that, the term is blue washing, right? Is sort of described as if it's a sustainable thing. And the certifying bodies that talk about what sustainable is often haven't worked to eliminate bycatch. So if you are someone who does consume animal products, or you want to talk to someone in your family who is, and they're talking about sustainable fish, look at that agency's policy about bycatch, because if they are not working to eliminate bycatch, then it can't really be called sustainable.
Thank you, Jennifer. Okay, while we're talking myths, eating local is so often touted as the environmental solution in food movements. So folks, what's the best way to explain to folks that eating meat, dairy, eggs that are sourced locally doesn't make it environmentally friendly?
Can I answer that too?
Please go for it.
To start, local is a geographical description. It doesn't mean that your food is organic. It doesn't mean it's humane. It doesn't mean it's produced in a way that's environmentally sustainable. So I live in Northern California in the North Bay. We're so proud of our food. It's a food hub. And calling something local is a point of pride here. I also live near local factory farms. And one of them, for example, calls itself Regenerative, and it's a dairy, and it's on a national seashore. And it's a huge threat to the Tula elk and to the water pollution and other wildlife in that area and the grasslands, for example. So on the one hand, obviously, I hope this is obvious, local doesn't necessarily mean it's good. On the other hand, local is important for local communities and for strengthening community economy and shortening the supply chain and that kind of thing. But for produce, for vegetables, local food is a really good choice. But for meat and dairy in particular, in terms of the emissions, because the emissions are catastrophic, it's really only about 4% of the overall emissions. So local's good, but it's much more important to reduce or eliminate meat and dairy.
Okay, so yeah, it's an incredibly important thing because it's just everywhere. Okay, folks, we're getting into some sort of visioning thinking here. Do you have any ideas, and we can just totally spitball here, on ways that we can get more people, organizations, governments to acknowledge the degree to which animal agriculture and eating meat and animal products contributes to environmental destruction, and act on this? So, you know, I'm sure you all have your different theories. I'd love to hear them. You're like, nope, you got nothing.
I have theories.
Yeah, Jason,
Yeah.
did you? Oh, sorry, Nick. That was Nick. Okay.
I was just saying, I don't have the answer to this, but I mean, I would say factoring in land into carbon emissions would be a huge step in the right direction, because all these countries are trying to hit carbon targets. They're trying to be net zero, whatever that term even means anymore. And they're trying to do this by accounting for what's emitting and what can draw down carbon. So with agriculture, if we factor in how much land we could actually free up by shifting to plant-based diets, then you're talking a big shift in terms of how much they need to look at this topic. And I know there's researchers working at this and proposing it to different governments across the world. I think there's a barrier to this because so many governments are so heavily lobbied by animal agriculture. There's so much subsidies going towards meat and dairy to prop up this as a source of food, whether it's healthy, whether it's environmentally friendly. I think with most governments, I think you would get further by talking about the innovation in the plant-based space, getting more abundant access of plant-based foods to everyone. And that can be plant-based products, that can be more lentils, that can be better priced fruits and vegetables. I think working through that solutions lens can be helpful, but I'm also cognizant that we can't eat into the share of meat and dairy without actually regulating that in some way and reducing that. And it's a challenge.
Jennifer, your organization promotes reducing the consumption of animal products for environmental reasons. So tell us about the strategy of advocating for reducing as opposed to eliminating.
Sure. I have answers to your other question too.
Oh yeah, please, whichever one you wanted to go first with.
Yeah. So my answer to the question about what we need to do is policy. We have a lot of voluntary standards, and shockingly, voluntary standards aren't going to work. So we need to have policy and regulation. And for the best producers, if they're well-intentioned and they're absolutely convinced that these things planet, then why not have these policies on the books, right? And then also market forces. So individual and systemic change at the same time driving each other. And another opportunity is procurement. So institutional procurement, setting standards and targets for reducing meat consumption there, as well as education. In terms of why, as a wildlife and conservation organization, we would urge reduction. Right now, we're urging 90% reduction in beef, 50% reduction in meat, dairy, and seafood, based on climate scenarios that show modeling of this being a pathway. But we're not saying limit it to that, reduce as much as possible, but that's a baseline minimum. But the reason that we use that is that some of the data is showing that people who identify as plant-based, whether for health or other reasons, or vegan, is sort of a group that has statistically remained about the same in size. Whereas there's another group of people who are flexitarian, reducitarian, omnivores, whatever you want to call it, interested in plant-based alternatives, interested in reducing their meat consumption, getting interested in the environment, animal welfare, health, and all of these issues intertwining. And that big group is willing to move a little bit. And so I see our movements in tandem and not in competition. I know that some people will find the reduction message not satisfying, but it's also a new pathway to reach new people who have been stubborn on this issue, or maybe will close their ears. And so that's the main argument, is sort of tracking that data of what's the most effective strategy in our work.
Because it's I think the most important thing right now is to move people from the idea that there are animals who are actually good for the environment over to animals are bad for the environment. Eating animals is bad for the environment. Let's just work on that. And so that might help people to listen to the message more when we're not saying go vegan right away. We will eventually, but Adria, I'm thinking you might be the newest to the world of how much animal products cause environmental damage. I mean, you've probably had a sense of it for a long time, but I know that with Corporate Nights, you've been doing a lot of coverage of this. And so what's kind of been your path of discovery around this? And what has really grabbed you and resonated for you as like, people need to know this?
Well, I stopped eating meat when I was a teenager, and I'm in my mid-40s now, so it's been a while. But for me, what grabbed me and what converted me was, actually just seeing the movie Baraka, and it didn't even have to see a lot of like horrific slaughterhouse images to just see, what happened to chicks in that film, and I was like, okay, I'm done. But that is kind of one way of winning people over, still remains seeing the animal welfare side of things. And that's, one of the most potent, I think. But on the environment side, I guess in my work probably as ecoholic, originally before Corporate Nights, was just learning more about industrialized meat. It was more of a shocker. And in terms of regenerative, it's just, are you speaking specifically to getting off meat entirely?
No, I'm speaking in terms of like really, again, you've been in the environmental space for a while, but it's sort of, the environmental movement is only sort of starting to wade into the damaging effects of eating animals. And so just that sort of thing, like, the discovery of how destructive this is, there's certain sort of, are there certain things that sort of have stuck out to you?
I mean, I think that the fact that it is really one of the number one things you can do to prevent climate change is what stuck with me the most. And that's one thing that I've been repeating for years when people ask me, and they're asking me for tips on how to go green. They might not be looking for tips related to food. And I always say the number one thing is to cut out or reduce their meat consumption. It's hard to say reduce when you want to just say cut out. But like Jennifer, sometimes it feels like just in terms of the psychology of winning over people who are hardcore meat eaters, to tell them to give it up entirely, they'll just shut down. And it's partly about baby steps, and having actually some really great plant-based alternatives. Not everyone is into kind of some of the more processed plant-based alternatives, but having that option to show a meat eater that say a Beyond Burger is just as tasty to them, having those options available even at mainstream places does help, I find, win over that crowd. But for me, it's always just been the climate that has been the most potent part of staying on message with this, because I switched over for animal welfare reasons, but I've stayed here because of the climate. We know that this planet is headed for catastrophe. We know that climate change is threatening all of our futures. And if this is such an easy thing to reduce and to cut out, then why do we have to keep eating beef? It just seems like such a small part of our lives. I understand that it will be different for different cultures. I'm half Greek, half French Canadian. It's not really, beef isn't super central to the Greek diet, but it is for others. And so it's hard for me to judge that entirely. But I just hope that for the sake of the planet that we get this right. And that would be my focus, is really the climate emissions.
When you're talking to people on this topic, what is the thing that you feel most gets through to them?
Sorry, were you addressing me?
Yeah, Jason. Yes, sorry.
Yeah. So I think it depends on the audience. I've been very, very frustrated here in Canada, here in Manitoba, with so much of the progressive crowd, the left here, being very hostile to any kind of argument for reducing meat consumption or for dismantling factory farms, partly because they see this as a matter of respect for workers and workers' rights. And so that's a huge barrier to even being able to bring up this argument. And I think, what Jennifer was touching upon is a really, really important point about bringing up the colonial history of this industry, right? Virginia Anderson has a very good book called Creatures of Empire, which goes into the role that these farms played in the expansion of settler colonies all across the Americas. And I find that once you start talking about that history, that really does a very effective job in shutting people up. You always ask two questions. One is, where do the animals come from? And then, because, the pigs and the cows, they're not native. They were brought here by Europeans and subjected to a colonial form of agriculture that was a driver of ethnic cleansing. And then ask, there's a lot of pride on both the left and the right about so-and-so is a 6th generation cattle rancher, or so-and-so is, a 7th generation animal farmer. There's so much pride invested in that. So it's like, okay, fine. Where did the 1st generation get the land from? Because that history is completely wiped out. And there's a certain kind of, the romantic mythology about the animal farms. There's a present day kind of aspect to that, but then it also rests on the erasure of history. And I think bringing that history in is a very good way for shifting the terms of the discussion so that we're not getting into these debates about soil. And I hate getting into those debates, but talking about the history is a very good way to kind of change the terms of the discussion. And I found that it's effective for winning over people who are members of, the progressive movement and the left. But I've also found that my Indigenous students are very, very receptive for building a kind of strategic alliance between the animal rights movement and the Indigenous rights movement, because they can unite in their opposition to this, colonial kind of, menace that's spread out across the land, right? And so a big thing in Canada is land back, right? So fine, let's dismantle all of the animal farms and return it back to, First Nations. And I find that, at least in my classes, this kind of idea has been very, very appealing to my Indigenous students, right? So I'm a huge advocate of teaching the history and then building these strategic relationships and partnerships. We know that, okay, it's fine. First Nations are not vegan, and I don't think they have to be, but we can still kind of form an alliance to basically take on tactically animal agriculture. And that's something that I would like to see us build as a movement. And so in that respect, I don't think the generic kind of slogan of go vegan is necessarily always in every moment the right kind of slogan. I think a better one is, smash animal ag. You can get First Nations on board with that one very easily.
Yes, Jennifer.
That was such a great point, Jason. Thank you so much. And you mentioned workers, and what I'm trying to do in my work is finding coalition building opportunities that are intersectional to support the workers. The meatpacking industry, the slaughterhouse is the most dangerous industry, the most exploitative of the most marginalized, already exploited people. And so building coalition work with these groups helps them also be more open-minded to the message, which may be, portrayed as something white and elitist and that kind of thing, which is not true historically or now. And so building these coalitions is so important in terms of exploitation, in terms of the history. And I think people start opening, like in the pandemic, the way that these workers were treated, I think really helped people make connections between the humans, the workers, the communities, the animals, the wildlife, and just these sort of corporations taking over and exploiting the entire world.
Mm. So, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, both of you said perfectly that. And if I could just add that I do think there's an area that landowners can be brought on in a form of drawing down carbon and conservation. I think that is a part that can bring them on board. And I just want to reinforce the idea that if we look at all jobs in animal agriculture, the vast majority of them are horrible, terrible jobs, just like you mentioned, Jennifer. So, we have this idea that everyone is like a very happy, prideful rancher. That's not how the food gets to the table. It's factory farms, it's slaughterhouses, and there needs to be efforts to get people that can be supported in better jobs.
So we have about 10 minutes left, and we're going to try and get a couple of questions in, but I just want to sort of get Jamie in here, our moderator, chat moderator with the mostest here. Jamie, let's just spotlight you for a second. The chat has been going so fast and furious. Can you give a little sense of what's been happening in the chat? Anything that sort of, any trends, any things going on that we should know about?
Yeah. We spent a lot of time on cows, and I know people wanted to hear a little bit about chickens, which we touched on, but I feel like every animal needs its own panel for us to discuss. So sorry if we didn't talk much about fishes and chickens and the smaller ones, but we will get to that in future panels. And yeah, everyone's just loving our panelists so far. Sorry,
and you got rid of the spammers. So we obviously, I love when you're enough of a threat to the industry that they send in the trolls. It's awesome.
They're doing so great. Everyone's loving you today. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Jamie. Okay, so folks, a few quick questions. First of all, something that we didn't address, but this is probably the first point of a conversation that we're going to have with somebody about animal ag and the environmental impacts. What % of global greenhouse gas emissions comes from animal agriculture? I've heard 12%. I've heard 50%. Nick, when you talk to somebody, what do you say?
I mean, this is one area that I've gotten quite a bit of heat from both sides. I don't think there's a perfect answer to this. It's very hard to quantify exactly how much is attributed to animal agriculture. It's hard to quantify, especially when we're not factoring in land, which you rarely ever do. You're not factoring in how much land could be freed up and how much carbon could be drawn down. That's not factored into this number. So, I mean, to directly answer your question, the most respected number is 14.5% globally. That's an FAO number, and it's a very outdated number. It's from 2013, and it had a whole lot of livestock meat secretariat involvement in this number. It's very much a baseline number. There's been studies like a study from Poor and Nemechek in 2018. It was one of the biggest meta-analyses on food, and they showed that if you shifted fully to a plant-based diet, you would reduce emissions by about 28%. I think that's a pretty good number. I would say it's somewhere between, 15 and maybe at the very high level, 30, 35, but I wouldn't go any higher than that because fossil fuel has a huge impact too. And we also don't know, there's a lot of uncertainties around carbon drawdown. There's a lot of things that are attributed to the future, which you can't always attribute to animal agriculture. And this is a very complicated topic. There's a whole lot of greenhouse gas accounting that goes into it. I certainly don't claim to have all the answers, but I think it's probably somewhere around there.
I agree with Nick. Just did that 14.5% stat. I guess is it's been around for a long time. But if you are going to use it, that the interesting thing about it is that, as most of you probably know, that that's equivalent to all the cars, planes, trains, trucks, and ships in the world. So even the most conservative stats says that's
one thing with that stat, though, Like there's one little issue with that stat. Like it's not like the full life cycle of all the cars and all that, but it doesn't matter. That's still such a huge stat. It's equivalent to all the tailpipe emissions from all transportation. Yeah. So I mean that is a stat that definitely can be used. But to and then we shouldn't even necessarily be measuring all transportation with a full life cycle analysis, right? There's certain reasons and methods of using this. So yeah, I mean, your point remains the exact same. It's such a huge amount, even at 14.5%.
Right.
If I could just mention something about Cowspiracy, because the number that they give in that documentary is very, very high. I think it's over 50%. I think we do a great disservice to our movement when we kind of invoke exaggerated figures like the one that's given in that documentary. We end up just discrediting ourselves. And so it's been mentioned in the chat, that paper on which the conspiracy figure is based of 51%, but that's not a peer-reviewed study, and it's been disputed. And I think that if we go into the public realm and we bring in, as much as we despise this industry, if we go in and say that, you know, animal agriculture is responsible for 90% or whatever, we're going to look like fools and we're going to discredit ourselves. So, you know, I think it's important to make sure that we have the science to back up exactly what we're saying.
We don't want to be another Alan Savory.
Right.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we don't want to be Alan Sabers of the other side. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, and that paper that that was the 51% figure from Cowspiracy, that was from you know, some good scientists, and they did bring up good points. Like Robert Goodlane, he's a pretty highly respected ecologist, but there was a number of errors he made. It wasn't peer reviewed at all to a level that it should have been. They just had some internal kind of review. And it was a very short paper. Like it didn't go into the details it needed to. And factoring in livestock respiration was one of the biggest errors it made. And it just kind of ridiculed the whole thing. So it's unfortunate because they did bring up some good points about methane that still aren't applied today. Methane is not valued at the level it should be. And they did bring this up in the paper. And if it was valued at the level it should be, then it would be way higher than 14.5%.
Folks, do you just have an extra 5 minutes? I just want to ask a couple more questions. Is that okay? Or are you know, getting, okay, thank you. Because there's so many things people want to know. So Debbie and Nethal have kind of similar questions. Debbie asked, would part of the solution be to push the government for meaningful standards and labeling? And Nethal asks, how much can we scale up rewilding, conservation, restoration, payment schemes to farmers, fishers, and other producers in animal ag? So we're talking about policy stuff here. Are there any meaningful policies that any of you kind of like are embracing? Not really. Yeah, Jason.
So it's not so much a policy response as it is kind of a media response. One of the, if it's okay, if I can address that.
Absolutely.
I guess one of the things that has frustrated me, I'm very frustrated, I'm a very frustrated person, about the meat industry is the way that they have weaponized expertise. Right, so they can. It's not like they just have a boardroom where they have the madmen of meat industry advertising coming up with clever talking points. They rely on, you know, agricultural scientists from ag schools all across North America. And you know, so every time there's some sort of, you know, news story in the CBC or CTV or whatever, they can very easily tap into this, you know, large kind of, you know, network of these experts who can be deployed, you know, instantly to comment on these reports about, you know, the miraculous, ecological, wonders of regenerative grazing and so forth. And I think that on our side, we have nowhere near the kind of strong networks that they do. So I think it would be a really, really good, you know, kind of advantageous strategic idea for us to have some sort of, you know, I don't know, like a think tank maybe, or something like that, where there's a kind of like a list almost like a Rolodex of experts listed, scientists and so forth, who can be relied upon by journalists who are looking for experts. So they don't just have to go to these ag schools. They can turn to the other side as well. There's some sort of organization and strategic networking and network building that we have to do on our side. If they're going to play the politics of expertise, I think we need to do the same thing as well.
I think,
yeah, go ahead.
I think that's a really good point. And if I could just kind of answer the policy side, in Canada, one of the lowest hanging fruit is the Canada Food Guide. And this was something put in place through policy. It's not being implemented nearly to the level it needs to be. This advocates for a mostly plant-based diet. There's no direct dairy category anymore. There's no direct meat category. It's a protein category. And this is happening across the world too, in different countries. And using this to make sure these options are offered in schools, hospitals, government facilities. It should be one of the easiest things, because you can bring it up with politicians, you can point to that. And yeah, I mean, the other thing, policy, we need to shift subsidies in a major way. I think a lot of the governmental stances is, I've seen this in Canada, I've seen this in other countries too, is we support animal agriculture, we support plant agriculture. That's not good enough. It's not good enough. It's with energy, you don't say I support coal business and I support renewables, although that might happen in some places, but the conversation is certainly shifting there, and it needs to shift with food too.
I think we need to see plant-based diets offered at the institutional level, as someone mentioned earlier. So, wherever you work, or if you're, you work for a school, hospital, etc., you can lobby the government about this too. As was mentioned earlier, I would bring that back up. That's a big one for sure. And on the counter to kind of the need to have regenerative to protect our wildlife, there is a push to globally preserve or give back 50% of nature. National Observer actually, I think, reprinted a piece on this that was originally from Grist. Check it out. I think it's titled "Give 50% of World Back to Nature." If you're looking to learn more about rewilding, there's some great info in there. And that is a policy that's being tossed around. I know the UK is really big on rewilding right now. They're calling for 5% of their, I think, ag land to go back to be rewilded. There are some stats in Canada as well. In our last issue, we were calling for forested land to be expanded by 30% as part of that rewilding effort.
And how about the Netherlands? Doing, a 25 billion euro plan to drastically reduce the number of livestock in the country. Anybody, is that impressive, or did that come out of nowhere? Are they one of the leaders in that, or is anybody else doing a really great job in this area?
Well, they are drowning in manure. That's why they're doing that.
Got it.
So this question of we need animals because we need manure. We have way too much manure. We have here we have 13 times the amount of human manure is produced by animal agriculture. So I don't know if they're doing a great job. They're a big meat producer and they're drowning manure for a reason. They haven't done a great job. So that's a good policy. Dietary guidelines policy to put sustainability into it, to say this is how much is healthy for you and this is how much is sustainable for the planet. So therefore, make this recommendation that would affect all of the other institutional policies as well, make it easier. I think someone in the chat mentioned the New York City public schools is going to be going vegan on Fridays, which is a good example as well. Getting to schools is millions of children, billions of dollars, billions of meals a year. So policies like that. Rewilding is really, really important. Shifting subsidies, we've been talking about a lot, but even understanding the history of subsidies and why things are overproduced. We're thinking animal agriculture, but we need to stop producing corn as well, because we could assume we produce so much corn because we have so many cows and so many other animals, but it's the opposite. We're overproducing these animals because we're overproducing corn, and that goes back to the historical overproduction. And we have ethanol, which is a ridiculous industry. And so we need to branch out the policy rather than paying farmers to have voluntary standards of, cover cropping, things they should be doing anyway that would financially benefit them. We need to think about models that would increase food access, food justice issues, access to healthy sustainable food, and shift subsidies that way, so that we are paying people, crop insurance. This is the main area of the subsidy that we need to shift towards things that are climate resilient, but also healthy for the planet as well, rather than just saying, well, hey, farmers, we'll give you a little money if you do sort of a slightly better job. We need to think a little bit bigger than that.
So just we'll leave it at this, this last question. We were talking about sort of the voices to be able to lead this charge. And Norman in the community asked, the information space is so polluted now, whose facts and figures do you consider authoritative? And I'm wondering if you do have suggestions for articles, publications, videos, websites that are really succinct and digestible in breaking down the environmental damage of consuming animal products, that have some facts and figures perhaps that are really, that we can really rely on. Do you have some favorites out there, folks?
Yeah, Tara Garnett's Grazed and Confused report out of Oxford does a very, very good job of blowing Alan Savory's model out of the water. It's a very, very good kind of critique and dismantling of the mythology surrounding holistic grazing. I would definitely recommend that one. And the title is also just brilliant too.
I love it. I love it. Jennifer, you're about to launch something big. Tell us about it.
I am. So we have Take Extinction Off Your Plate, which I've put a lot of work into, and we have a lot of good stats there, and we link to other things that are credible as well. But we are also about to launch a grazing website, which Nicholas has looked at, that be about grazing facts that counter all of this BS and all of the greenwashing. We've been working on it for like a year, so there's a lot of hard work we putting into that. And we're also going to be having a webinar series, I think, hopefully as good as this one. And we will also have Tara Garnett on it. So I will be sending out that, look for that. I think everybody on this will be able to continue the conversation that way.
It's amazing. And Jennifer, I'll get you to send that to me, and I will share it with the AJA community, because I know this is just such a hot topic, and we would love to help disperse and disseminate this website. Okay.
Thank you.
Anybody else have some standbys that they really like to go to, or some, again, just some figures and some data? Nick, we have to do a shout out to plantbaseddata.org. Can you tell folks about this site?
Yeah, so I think at a very high level, like the access to the best peer review evidence is an issue. There's so many paywalls that it's behind. There should be no barriers to what I consider some of the best scientific evidence. So yeah, plant-based data, we have probably what's the biggest collection of peer-reviewed papers looking specifically at this topic from the aspect of the environment, for health, pandemics, economics and policy. And yeah, it's all open access. Everyone can go dive in. Now, we've also done some summaries, because I understand not everyone's going to read a lot of these papers. We've done lots of summaries of different papers. I share a lot of it on Twitter, some of it on Instagram too. Yeah, I would just say dig into that. And I would also give a shout out to Our World in Data. I think they've done a really good job too in breaking down some complex papers into a lot of very beautiful graphs that you can even pinpoint by country, pinpoint by food. You can compare soy to chicken, for example, and see that soy is at least 6 times less emitting. You can do this right through their site, and it's very, very accessible. So yeah, I would say that.
Yeah, World in Data is really great. I think we actually dropped a link in when we were talking about the local myth, because Hannah Ritchie's article about local eating is just incredible. It's one that everybody should really study, and not just for the local argument, but just some really great graphs in general comparing the animal products to plant-based products. And Adria, do you have any sort of go-tos? Probably
well,
Jessica Scott Reed is one of them, right?
I was going to say, guys, I can't leave without, besides plugging Nicholas's great site. Corporate Nights is obviously not entirely dedicated to this, but we do make a point of having plant-based content in every issue. And Jessica Scott Reed's been really great to work with. Her, you can, if you want to learn more about chicken greenwashing, if you feel like there wasn't enough in this particular panel, because there's never enough time, then check out her piece on our sustainability poultry claims, all they're cracked up to be. She's got some great facts in that. And tomorrow on our site, we are running her latest piece, which is actually on the rise of vegan pet food and plant-based pet food. So if you're wondering how to feed your cat or dog, especially dogs right now, some alternatives, then yeah, Jessica's awesome. Follow us, hop on our site and you'll find some of her stuff there.
Wonderful. Yeah, we love Jess. She is amazing and has done so much for the movement in so many different ways. So folks, I just, let's take off the spotlight, Kirsten, as we come back to the community at large. And most of the folks have hung out, stayed with us, which is amazing. Speakers, you may want to go back to gallery view because you'll have been automatically put over to speaker view. So and these are your adoring community here. Animal Justice Academy. Can we give an AJ thank you to Jennifer and to Nick, to Adria and to Jason? Thank you so much, everybody. You have helped so much because we are a community of folks that are really trying to take our advocacy out into our communities, into our workplaces, into our campaigns. And so to arm us with some really, really great data, really great approaches, the ripples are going to be tremendous. So folks, I just want to say before you go that sorry, I'm just getting to my breakout. We are going to do breakout groups. And so if you would like to stay, to be able to discuss further, brainstorm, collaborate around tonight's theme, just stick around after this final goodbye. And the rest of you, we will see you hopefully for our panel in about a month. And it's going to be about helping people better understand animal sentience. So if you're subscribed to AJA, you'll get an email notice. And if you're not subscribed to AJA, you can sign up for free at animaljusticeacademy.com. All right, folks, thank you very much. Do our panelists have anything else to say?
Thank you for having us.
Okay, well, so let's get out there and get super strategic, folks, in how to help people understand animal ag's environmental costs so we can help save the planet and create a better world for animals. Thank you very much.